Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance for one of their celebrity lectures. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. In the gloomy pre-dawn light, the morning stillness was shattered by the throaty roar of a powerful radial engine. The pilot, with grim determination, taxied his craft for takeoff. Simultaneously, another equally determined pilot launched his craft. Soon, the two adversaries met in the clear skies far overhead. They twisted and climbed, banked and dove, each trying to maneuver his warplane into a firing position on the tail or flank of the other. Before long, it became evident that neither would be able to shoot down the other. So they both landed at Torrance Airport and met in the General Aviation Center for a cup of coffee and a snack. Fortunately, because they survived their encounter, we are now graced with the presence of Rob Lips Hertberg and Chris Chief Rushing, who will regale us with stories of their special craft. Ladies and gentlemen, Lips and Chris.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. We are certainly glad to be here, and we're really glad to be able to bring these aviation icons here to display for you guys. Kind of the plan we want to do this morning is we're going to talk real briefly about ourselves and how we got to be here, being able to fly these airplanes. And then we're going to kind of somewhat chronologically go through the era and the design and the development and some of the combat actions of these two airplanes back 70 years ago. We'll then talk a little bit about how the airplanes went from their production in whatever year, 42, 45, and ended up out here on your ramp in flyable condition. And then we want to take a little bit, hopefully it's not a gamble, and we want to split the crowd up and go out to the airplanes. And Chris and I will respectively kind of do a, if you will, a combat walk around of the airplanes and just point out, kind of reinforcing some of the things we may have talked about, some of the issues on the airplanes and their design specifications and requirements that led them to be the aircraft they were in combat. So, and then after that, we hope to, Chris and I will do our pilot thing, and we hope to get a couple passes when we depart out of here for you. We'll see what we can do, what tower allows, and we have to follow the appropriate noise abatement procedures. It's not an air show, so we can't put on an air show for you. But we'll try and get you a couple passes with the Zero and the Hellcat together in the same piece of sky. Okay, with that, real quick about me. I'm a retired Air Force pilot. I was able to spend a career flying F-16s. In the last portions of my time in uniform, I got involved with the air show industry, and I got smitten really, really badly with warbirds. So when I retired, I was able to buy a share of a T6, a World War II trainer, and I started building time. What's real important about that is it's tail dragger time, so that helped. Also, through my years in the air show industry, I was able to meet and befriend some of the pilots in the commemorative Air Force unit at Camarillo. So after talking with them and seeing what they required to join and maybe fly some of their airplanes, I joined the unit. I did whatever they needed me to do to help out that organization. I went through their training program to get into fighters, which is primarily flying the back seat of the T6. And then I was able to check out in the Zero, been flying it for about 2.5 years. And the end of last year, I was able to upgrade and also check out in the Hellcat.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Cindy and Bruce, for allowing me to speak in front of such of a distinguished group. I hope I can do it somewhat justice. I just went over, I'm a member of the California Air National Guard up in Point Mugu. I'm a Chief Master Sergeant in the Air National Guard, hence my call sign Chief. I got in the Air Force in 1977. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. So I wanted to see the world, so I joined the Air Force, and I spent 4 years at Little Rock, Arkansas. I got out of the Air Force in Arkansas, went back to the Tennessee Air National Guard. I spent about 7 years there, and I transferred to the California Air National Guard, 146 at Van Nuys. In that transition, you know, grew up in Tennessee, spent 4 years in Arkansas, so now I'm in Van Nuys, California, and I think I made the transition pretty good. Some people tell me now they had a real hard time understanding me with my southern drawl, but the worst thing for me was just having to wear shoes all the time. I don't know. But I have had a real good career in the Air National Guard. We're on the C-130J model now up at Point Mugu. I've seen a lot of what we call time in the sandbox since 9/11, so I think we're getting that somewhat underhandled, and still going back over there with our C-130s. So I'm real fortunate, and as a member of the 146 in Van Nuys, I became a member of the Condor Squadron at Van Nuys, founded by Richard Sykes and Walter Morrison there at Taxiway Alpha, right down from the guard base, and where they had T6s, and that's how I learned to fly the T6. As Lips was saying, that's how we transition into these fighters. You have a lot of T6 time. People ask me, well, how do I get to fly one of these? And I say, well, buy a T6 and learn how to fly it. Because like Lips was saying, the transition is you check out from the back of a T6. So you do with two inspectors or two examiners, and if you can perform the total flight profile from the back, that's engine start to takeoff, taxi, everything from the back, then if you can do that well, they think you can fly these. So, like I said, it's a real honor to be here with you guys. I, like I said, fly with the Condor Squadron. I race in Reno for the last 5 years in the T6 class, so we'll be going back up there in September. So if any of you are at the Reno Air Races, please stop by my pit. We have 2 airplanes painted the same, race 14, race 42. So please stop by and say hi, and hope you enjoy, hopefully not the last race at Reno. We've had some struggles the last few years, but it's something that a lot of people enjoy, and we hope we can continue that. So I enjoy the Commemorative Air Force up in Camarillo. That's where we are out of. Our wing is growing tremendously, a lot of participation, so we're working really hard to keep these warbirds flying, and I appreciate you guys' participation.
Okay, you put your book on my cards. Chris omitted the fact that last year at Reno, he won 3rd place in the gold in T6, and that's quite an accomplishment. It's an experienced and high-quality air racer back here. But I don't like Chief. I like Tennessee Tree Trunk a lot better. Okay, October 1937. The Imperial Japanese Navy issue a requirement to the Japanese aviation industry for a new fighter, the Prototype 12 carrier-based fighter. Prototype 12, the number 12 came from, it was 1937, was the 12th year of the reign of the current emperor. So Japanese aviation industry got busy. It's very interesting to note that Nakajima, which was busy making airplanes at the time, withdrew from the competition because they said the requirements set by the Japanese Navy were not achievable at that time. So here's some of the requirements. It had to be, the airplane had to be travel greater than 300 miles an hour at 12,000 feet. It had to have a range of 1,100 miles. It had to have the maneuverability of an escort fighter and an interceptor. which may be also called like a point defense or a home defense fighter. It needed to have a wingspan less than 39 feet so it could fit inside a carrier on the carrier's elevators. And it had to have direction finding equipment so that it could travel these long distances over the Pacific that the Navy was anticipating needing to do. And a lot of those requirements, specifically the dogfight, maneuvering potential, and the long range, were driven by the lessons that they were learning in their war with China at the time. So here's what the design bureau at Mitsubishi came up with, led by Hiro Horikoshi, who was the chief engineer. And if I mispronounce some of these names, please forgive me on that. But they came up with a low wing monoplane when biplanes were still very, very prevalent in the aviation industry. It had a very light weight. That was the driving factor to this airplane, was the light weight, so that it could go those ranges that the Navy required. They developed an aircraft that had a very low wing loading, and that's important in that maneuverability. Wing loading is basically the relation of the weight of the airplane with the size of the wing. The less it weighed, the bigger the wing, and that's the less weight per unit of wing. And what that gives you is a very slow stall speed, which equates to a very slow flying speed and great maneuverability. Enclosed cockpit, that was a little different. Retractable landing gear. It also had, for the time, this is 37, 38, 39, very, very high or heavy firepower. It had two 20-millimeter cannons that equates to about 80 caliber. So that's a large caliber weapon, and it had two 7.7 millimeter machine guns on it. It was flush riveted, which was relatively new in the aviation, and so that helped be the slickness so that it could again travel great distances and then dogfight really well. The lightweight, I can't say invented, and I don't want to use the word reverse engineered, but at the time, one of the Japanese companies was experimenting with a very, very light and strong aluminum, duralumin, and that was at that time in '38 a top secret thing. It hadn't prevailed around the globe in the aviation industry, but it was very light and very strong, so they used that. They also used lightning holes. If you can imagine a piece of aluminum like would brace the inside of a wing, well, they would cut holes in it, and that reduced the weight without losing strength. Some of the other things real important on the design of this airplane, to keep it light, they didn't put any armor in the airplane, and they didn't use self-sealing fuel tanks. That turned out to be a real key when the Allies started shooting back. So those were the major design factors. So as we keep going, let's talk some dates. April 1st of 1939 was the first flight of the A6M1 Type 0 prototype. It had a two-bladed wooden prop, but that was driving some vibration issues. So they went to a three-bladed metal prop, and that solved some of the initial problems that they had with vibrations. The main fuel tanks were just on the inside of the wings, but they also had a fair amount of fuel in between the cockpit and the engine. Roughly 40 gallons there, and that was significant. That was significant to get the range they needed. The Navy then heard about a new, and that had a Mitsubishi engine on it. Well, the Navy at the time heard that Nakajima was experimenting with an engine, and so they told Mitsubishi, put this Nakajima engine on it. That engine had a little more horsepower. It was the same weight. They got about a 20% increase in horsepower. That helped them out greatly. So that was early 1940. The A6M1 Type 0 Model 11 rolled out, and that was what the Japanese Navy accepted in July of '40. The aircraft was immediately, and I mean that month, sent to China for the war against China. And in September of 40, they had their first victories over Russian-built, Chinese-flown I-15s and 16s. Some of those were biplanes. So this is now a hot new fighter fighting biplanes. Okay, so let's go on. Let's move on a little bit into November of 1940. So now they're building some lessons learned from the Chinese War, and now the A6M2 Model 11 rolls out. If you could recall back, one of the requirements that was the wingspan had to be less than 39 feet so it could fit on a carrier. Well, the original one was just a couple inches over that. So what did they do? They took about 1.5 feet on each side and they put folding wingtips on it. So now that aircraft could jump on that elevator on those Japanese carriers and go up and down. And that was the Model 21. The way the Japanese did their mnemonics, the first letter was the airframe, the second letter was the engine. So we start with the 11, the basic. They changed the airframe with these foldable wing types, and now you have a Model 21 in November 40. That was greatly produced early in the war, and that would have been the model that would have flown in Pearl Harbor and some of the early large engagements. So December 41 rolls around. I think we know what happened then. That would have been the Model 21 that flew during that. In April of 42, this is an interesting change in their production of the airplane that kind of drove some of the lessons learned that they had seen so far. They went from the Model, I'm going to try and do this here, 21 to the Model 32. So what they did with the airframe was they got rid of the folding wingtips. So they shortened the wings, they squared them off so they were clipped wings. They put a larger Nakajima engine on it that required it to eat in some of that fuel that they had in between the cockpit and the engine. So remember the wing loading, lightweight, large wing. They've now increased weight and shortened the wings. So they lost maneuverability. And with the fuel lost, they lost the range. And what was important to them at that time is their empire was expanding. Where'd the microphone go? So as the empire is expanding, they want the range so that they can fly these great distances, dogfight, and fly back. And now they come up with this Model 32, and they've lost some of that range, and they've lost some of that maneuverability, and the pilots didn't like it. So they, in essence, revolted and said, we don't want that again. So fairly soon after that, they went backwards. And they went from the Model 32 to the Model 22. They kept the larger engine, but they went back to the larger wing with the folding wingtips so they could get the range back. And this was keenly seen in the Solomons campaign, where they were flying out of Rabaul. We've all heard of the Rabaul thing. And these Model 32s could fly to Guadalcanal, but then they had no loiter time to fight and get back. So they wanted to get that back. So by mid-1942 here, the Zero had racked up a 12-to-1 kill ratio against the older aircraft of the time. The F6F Wildcat was the chief Navy fighter. Brewster Buffaloes, the British were flying biplanes, and the Zero was cleaning house against those. But now as we progress into mid-42, we run into something called the Battle of the Coral Sea. And during that, the Japanese kind of walked away with a bit of a tactical victory, but a very much of a strategic loss, because they got bloodied. The Americans were fighting back. And I want a quick talk about how the Zero would fight the Wildcat. The Zero enjoyed performance advantages in almost every part of the envelope against the Wildcat. And that allowed it to have the high ground. That's real important. It could outclimb, it couldn't outdive, but it could outclimb and it could outturn the Wildcat. So it would come in on diving attacks, it could go up, and if the Wildcat tried to follow it, In most cases, the Wildcat could not, and so it would fall off. And the Zero had that superb maneuverability. Remember the low wing loading, slow speed, so it could come up here, do a real tight little loop and come back nose on, or could do a wing over. It could be very aerobatic and maneuver with a lot of agility at slow speeds. And so that's what it saw regularly. Come in high, shoot, go right back up, because it owned the high ground against the Wildcat. Keep that in mind. Okay, but then we have June of 42. What happens in June of 42? Midway. Okay, the Zeros themselves, respectively to all of the Allied fighters, performed pretty well. The Zeros did, both escorting the attack packages to the island and then protecting the fleet, but took some losses. Took some losses over the island, and took some losses from some of the Allied and American dive bombers that had rear gunners. So what is that? Losing some airplanes, losing some experienced pilots. So that's where in the mid-42 things started to change for the Zero. There are improved tactics by the Allies. There's a slow attrition of quality, high experienced pilots and aircraft. Some of those design features I talked about and the production, it was difficult for Japan at the time to mass produce and replace those losses. So where are we at? We're at the end of 1942, December 1942. Now they come out, I kind of told you about, we were at the Model 32, so they went backwards to the Model 22. Okay, let's get the folding, let's get the better wing on there with the folding wing tips, but let's keep that better engine, the larger engine. So they made up with the range, since they lost fuel, by putting outer wing tanks on it, which is what this aircraft has out here. Okay, I'm about to hand it over here. You're done talking to me, but let me point out a couple things as we move into 1943. Okay, there are some design weaknesses in the airplane. We talked about it being fairly lightly constructed. Sorry, not fairly, very lightly constructed. Doesn't have armor, doesn't have self-fueling fuel tanks. At the time in the 30s, it had the 7.7 millimeter machine guns. Well, as the Allies improve their airplanes, those become ineffective. So its firepower starts becoming a factor. So the design weaknesses, the production capability at home, now the Zero is not able to enjoy some of the advantages that it had up till that point in the war. Okay, let's see. I'm going to jump ahead to September 6th, 1943, and that's the first encounter of a Zero with a Hellcat. So here comes this Hellcat, and all through the war, not only in this encounter, but all the way through the war, the Zero enjoyed a turning advantage over every Allied airplane that it met. But that was turning. That's roll rate of roll, and this is at slower speed. What that allows you to do is to change your direction rapidly, and then also turn rate. How fast can I turn my nose around, either to get out of the way of bullets or to get my nose onto somebody to shoot my bullets. So I could enjoy that. But when I ran into this larger, darker blue airplane, that thing could climb with me. It couldn't out-climb me, but remember the Wildcat? I'd go up and it couldn't. I remember one time I go up with this Hellcat like this, and I look over my shoulder and I'm expecting to see this airplane fall off, and then he's mine. And instead what I see are bullets. Bullets coming out at my airplane. F6F Hellcat. Before I hand it off to Chris, a surviving Zero pilot said this of the Hellcat. Said the Hellcat is like a wild boar with sharp tusks, and the Zero is like a refined city girl. And you don't send a refined city girl out to fight a wild boar with sharp tusks.
Well, thank you, Lips. Fine segue into what we're looking at now. September 1943, there was a Washington Bulletin reported that the Grumman Hellcat shot down 21 Japanese planes with a loss of only 2 in the air battle over, it was an unidentified island on the South Pacific. And then the Hellcat at Wake Island on October 5th and 6th of 1943 accounted for 61 Japanese planes without the loss of a single F6F Hellcat. So the score for the 2 battles that went on, the one at Wake Island and the other one, the score now is 82-2 in favor of the F6F. Needless to say, when that word got back to Plant 3 where the Hellcat was being built, there was a lot of enthusiasm, but those guys were putting out a good product. Some of the characteristics of the airplane, the one that we have here, it's classified as a F6F F3 with a little bit of an F5. Features to it, it weighs 10,400 pounds. It has the R2800 engine on it, which is the 2,000 horsepower. We'll do, like Lip said, we'll do a walk around here in just a little bit. And we'll talk more about the gun. It's got 6 50 cal machine guns, 3 on each side. I'll show you what the barrels look like. And like Lips identified some of the characteristics, so I won't repeat that. But interesting enough, the Hellcat did not only perform in the Pacific. There was, however, an unusual action far removed from the Pacific during the mid-1944s. And they were dispatched in August of 1944. The Hellcats actually went over to south of France, and they were supporting the U.S. Army, and they blasted the Nazis along the shore during their northwest retract. So they had some significant battles against the Germans, where they shot down some Luftwaffe fighter pilots as well. You may notice that airplane is painted in Mincy 3 trademarks, and that is representative Lieutenant Dave McCampbell. Dave McCampbell was one of the leading fighter pilots in the Navy. He was a Medal of Honor winner, rolled up a score of 34 aerial victories and 20 destroyed on the ground. He commanded the air group, so he was the CAG, and that's, you'll see that on the top of the rudder in the white letters that spell out CAG, where he was in charge of the whole fleet. And most CAGs didn't want to fly and fight, but not Colonel McCampbell. He always wanted to lead his troops as he continued to fight. On June 19th, at the Great Mariner's Turkey Shoot, McCampbell got 7 Japanese fighters, and on 12 September over the Philippines, he got 4 more, and the next day he shot down 3. But that wasn't his best day. His best day was on 24 October when him and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, no relationship to me, attacked a formation of 40 Zeros. In one-sided slaughter, McCampbell shot down 9, while Rushing got 6, all in one day. So that the fight lasted about 10 minutes, and not once did the Japanese attempt to defend themselves or to attack the 2 Navy pilots. The kill ratio, as it goes on through the war, it continued to grow. It was 10-1, 15-1, but I've actually talked to a Hellcat pilot, and he said that he honestly believes by the end of the war it was a 19-1 kill ratio of enemy aircraft shot down. So very impressive airplane. The workmanship that was done on that airplane, Grumman's motto was build it strong, build it tough, build it fast, and that's certainly what they did. The range on it was remarkable. It holds 250 gallons of gas, And they started developing a lot of night flying with the Hellcat. A lot of the pilots were learning how to fly with radar. Some of the pilots were at the very beginning of radar night flying. And a lot of guys, you know, when they would go off at night and come back, sometimes that carrier would have to move because of a submarine or something, and you know, the guys were flying around trying to find the aircraft carrier, and sometimes, sadly, they couldn't find it. So it was a huge learning curve. It cost us a lot of sacrifices, but the development of some of that stuff is probably still the foundation of what we're doing today as far as some radar stuff. So that's about all I have. Like I said, I'll turn it back over to Lips, and then we'll get out and look at the airplanes when he's ready to turn you guys loose.
If I can go back briefly to what Chris talked about there in June '44, the Marianas turkey shoot. Not a good event for the Zero community. Through the battles previously, all the way back to mid-42 and 43, through attrition in both aircraft and pilots, the production of new aircraft and I said that right, and the training of new pilots, we are now sorting against this ever-increasing mass of Hellcats with very young and inexperienced pilots. And without the numbers, though we may show up in a formation, we don't know how to fight in a formation with support to each other. Our gunnery skills are poor because we're pretty much just out of the training, so I can safely take off and land the airplane, and that's about it. So as we engage in these smaller formations, we are quickly scattered, and we end up fighting as singles against ever-increasing numbers of better airplanes. And so the Marianas turkey shoot effectively ends the Zeros being a factor in the rest of the war. So for the remaining year until the summer of '45, they are used because there are some available as kamikazes, and that ends the Zero's claim to fame there. So before we break out, what I'd like to do, and hopefully Chris can jump on the Hellcat here, I want to talk real briefly about that green airplane, that one right there, and how we got it from the jungles of New Guinea to flyable condition. So as far as we know, it was built in December of 1942. We don't know its exact combat history, but we know it was abandoned by the Japanese at Babo Airfield on the western part of New Guinea, most probably in 1944 during the Allies' Western New Guinea campaign. I'm sure the Aborigines knew it was there from day one, but it was late 70s that Westerners discovered it, and then it took until early 90s for the right person with the right money and connections and motivation to pull the airplane out of the jungle. It and two others came up to the Santa Monica Museum of Flying and started into restoration. They didn't get too far, and they then sent the three airplanes to Russia. You know, what was happening in Russia in the early 90s? Quality, cheap labor. Plus the Yak company was starting to make new build Yaks, so that was the right place to do it. So the airplane went to Russia for restoration. I have some instruments in there that have Cyrillic writing on it. Very interesting. And it had instructions, don't put an engine on it. So they didn't put an engine on it. So it comes back to the States. This one here was sent to Chino, and they put the engine on it. By that time, the owner Santa Monica Museum of Flying had decided to put a Pratt & Whitney engine on it for availability of parts, availability of people to know how to take care of them. So that's got a Pratt & Whitney R1830, which is a DC-3/C47 engine on it. Chino got it all ready to go. It got blessed by the FAA in 1998 as an experimental airplane. It flew with Santa Monica for 4 to 5 years, and then the early 2000s, it was sold to the Commemorative Air Force, the Camarillo unit, and we've been flying it for a little over 10 years since then, as it is there. So it's a, if you remember my fingers, it's a Model 22. Okay, so that's when they went backwards. They wanted the maneuverability and the range, but they wanted to keep the larger engine. So it's a Model 22. You can see the folding wingtips, but it does have a Pratt & Whitney engine on it. Very interesting side note here. Before the war, the Japanese had license-built agreements with McDonnell Douglas to build the DC-3, Pratt & Whitney to build that engine, and Hamilton Standard to build 3-bladed metal props. So it was a natural fit for the restorers here to put a Pratt & Whitney 1830 on it. Our Hellcat did not make the war. It is not a combat veteran. So it was built, I believe, in late 45, early 46. It went to the Midwest, so it was one of the many, many naval bases up there around the Great Lakes. And that's where it did its military time before it was stricken from the records. It became a gate guard, if you will. It wasn't on a stick, but it was displayed at the gate of a naval base up there in the Great Lakes area, and there it sat for an awful long time. And then it bounced back and forth. Once the CAF got it, it bounced back and forth between sponsors who were trying to get it restored. Like most airplanes of this era, they're all kind of Franken restorations of this wing here, that fuselage there, this cockpit, this whatever. So it's pieces and parts of the F6F-3 and -5. And it flew for a little bit in the 1980s, and then the restoration was kind of discovered to maybe not have been all that good. So it was grounded for another 10 years or so, and an almost completely second restoration was done on it to get it into that shape, and there it is. And it's got a fairly freshly overhauled R2800 that makes a great deal of noise. Is Phil still here? Okay, makes a lot of noise, sounds great. And we've been flying it there at the Southern California wing again since early 2000, so about 10 years. Yes, Bill. Question from our ace Hellcat pilot was the Model 52, and I omitted that a bit because I was just talking too much. Okay, but I'll go backwards a little bit. So the question was about, back to my fingers. So we've gone to the 32. Which is the, let's clip the wings shorter and let's put this bigger engine on it. And the pilots went, don't have the range, don't have the maneuverability. So they went backwards to this 22. But then, remember, part of that was because their empire was still expanding. And now we get into 43, and we've got the Solomons, and we're moving through New Guinea, and we're moving up into the Marshalls, so their empire is shrinking. So now that range is not as important. So they went and they took their 32s, and they made them 52s, and if I give you all 5 fingers, I'm going to drop the mic, and Betty's going to come pouncing over this podium at me. Okay? So they kept that larger engine, the larger Nakajima. They took off the folding wingtips and they just rounded them. They increased the firepower because they were finding that 7.7 millimeters would do practically nothing to to the Hellcats, the ruggedness of the Hellcats. The 20 millimeters, which again was a whole bunch of firepower, but it had a low muzzle velocity. And so though it would certainly damage the Hellcat, it wasn't catastrophic damage that would knock the Hellcat down, as opposed to the Hellcat's 50 calibers, which would tear that up. Remember, lightweight, no armor, no self-sealing, fragile compared to the Hellcat. So the 52s had pretty good performance. The shorter wing, though, it increased that wing loading, heavier, less wing. That less wing allowed it to dive faster, which is what almost all of the Allied airplanes could do, was outdive it. And that's what the Hellcats started to do. The Hellcats learned the hard way, do not turn with that airplane. Do not turn. That ended up poorly. But they could run away. The Hellcat could easily run away from it or catch it. So that was one of the reasons, again, contracting empire. Let's worry less about the turning fight and let's go faster. And let's get some more firepower out there to try and even the odds against the Hellcat. So that was the Model 52, and that would have been the model that fought primarily in the Marianas Turkey Shoot in June of '44. Bill, I hope I answered your question there. And the 52 was actually the most produced of all of the different models of the Zero. So what else? Question, please. The question is, what is the current market value? And I'm going to say, and I'm guessing, I've heard some numbers. I'm really not into the financial aspect of the unit, but I think it's about $2 million. You know, to our knowledge, there's 5 of them flying in the world. The Zeros, there's 4 Hellcats flying in the world, so it's an even rarer airplane. But they're all extremely, because of the rarity, they're all valued very highly. If you forgive me, there's a question back here. Okay, the question was, some of the maneuvers we talked about that the Zero would execute against the Wildcat and the Hellcat that worked and then didn't work, can we, Chris and I, simulate those when we leave here today? And the answer is no, we cannot. We don't have waivered airspace. The tower, it's a functioning tower. They're not going to shut down because of us. They seem to like when we came in yesterday. They were just wonderful. So I think they'll help us clear some of the traffic pattern to let us do a couple passes. But no, we can't do the vertical stuff. So what we're going to try and do, again, if Tower works with us, and if Phil plugs his ears like this, we're going to try and do a tail chase with the Hellcat chasing the Zero. That's the reality of the relationship of those two airplanes in history. And I'm going to use that smoke system, and I'm going to die. Okay? And then we're going to try and get back together. I know you, patience with me. And then we're going to try and get back together in formation. So we'll try and do a second pass in formation with the Hellcat on the Zero wing. And if you all stay and are able to watch that, what'll amaze you is look at the differences in the sizes of the airplane. For those of you who were out here yesterday when we arrived, 2 or 3 people said that. It's amazing how, a couple guys said how big the Hellcat is, a couple guys said how small the Zero is. I'll be honest, I hate that question. I really do. But I'm going to answer it. The question is, it ties into the rumors that have persisted for 70 years of whether the Japanese copied the Howard Hughes Racer while they were developing this airplane. From what I have seen and heard, the answer is no, they did not. Okay, now there is a gray area in the global aviation world between reverse engineering, which means copying what someone else has done, and just the natural osmosis of good ideas. You know, this aluminum that they put on this airplane, by later in the war and into the late 40s is standard around the world. So you can't say that somebody building an airplane in 1948 copied that. They just used what was smart engineering-wise to produce airplanes. So that's the gray area between just using what has developed and is now readily available and actually copying somebody else's engineering. So directly to the question, from my understanding, no, they did not. I have read the book by the chief engineer. Now granted, he can write whatever he wants, but to my understanding and in other research that I've done and listening to people, no, it was not, ooh, look at this airplane, here's a model, I have some blueprints, let's copy it and put this part of the tail on this airplane and the wingtips. So I think the answer is no. Well, I think then yes, that's, I think, that part of that engineering osmosis around the aviation industries. It's proof of that, mid 43, late 43, just awakening of the Japanese pilots, the Zero pilots, as our aircraft, allied, not just American, but we know our production, what American production did. And I've read where one of the most hugely important aspects, not just of producing things, but producing better things, were the engines. In the aviation world, the horsepower of the engines, that is 2,000 horsepower. That's an amazingly powerful radial engine for being 70 years old. And the Japanese didn't. That, the design flaws we talked about, the production numbers we talked about. Our country wasn't getting bombed every day, 24/7, so they had huge production challenges. And not only that, but the advances that they made in engines. That Model 52 that Bill fought was the same engine that was put on the Model 32 2 years prior. Now 2 years doesn't seem like a long time, but that was an eternity with the amazing advances in aviation made due to combat in the... Yes. Great question. The question was, to surmise it, what was the Zero's air-to-ground strike capability? And yes, it was able to carry roughly a 500-pound bomb on the center line. They originally had put capability to carry fuel tanks, an external fuel tank on that center line. They then later in the war moved those to under the wing so they could carry wing tanks under the wings, but they could put a 500-pound bomb or so on the center line of the aircraft. Now, my understanding in Pearl Harbor and in the early fights, they were not using the Zero for ground attack role. So at Pearl Harbor, they would have used the Zeros to sweep the skies of American airplanes and then to strafe. So they would have used their machine guns and their cannon against targets on the ground. Personnel, aircraft in the open. As you remember from Pearl Harbor, what did we do? We put all our airplanes wingtip to wingtip. What a ripe target. When they transitioned to using the Zeros as kamikazes, they started putting bombs on them. And to my understanding, that's the really, other than scattered individual cases, that was the really the only repeated use of bombs on Zeros was when they started doing kamikaze attacks. Any other questions? Yes. These two here. The question is, what is the top speed? The Model 22 out here, Zero, has a top speed of 350 miles an hour, 300 knots. The top speed of the Hellcat is 415 knots. So that's 115, that's roughly approaching 150 miles an hour difference. And that's beyond significant. in a turning fight. The question was the weight. What are the weight differences of the airplane? So 5,200 pounds for the Zero, and with all the armor, as it would have been flown in combat, over 12,000 pounds for the Hellcat. So that's more than double. And so you can see where not only was the advancement in horsepower of our engines so advantageous, but it was pretty much needed. It was needed, but it worked out. So, 1,130 horsepower, 2,000 horsepower. So that's a significant. And the last Zero, this Model 52, would have been a little heavier, but with the same engine, the same 1,130 horsepower engine. So it could still go a little faster, but this almost complete and total dominance in the vertical that the Zero enjoyed until mid-43 went completely the other way. We're at low and medium altitude, so we're talking, low all the way down. They fought at 50 feet above the water, all the way to maybe the mid-teens, 15,000 feet. The Hellcat could outclimb the Zero. Once it got a little higher, where usually you're not up at 20,000 feet, or they would not have been, and going up. So if you start at 20,000 feet, because everyone wants to start high, because if this is me and the microphone is the enemy, this is potential energy. I can turn that altitude into airspeed. So the high ground is real vital, and the Zero lost that primarily due to that Hellcat. Did I answer your question? Go outside? Okay. We all like each other. We really do. We like each other, so be nice to each other. What I'm going to ask is, how about this half of the room go to the Hellcat? This half of the room go to the Zero. We'll spend about 20 minutes, and then we'll swap, and that's where we need to all be friendly and love each other. And Chris and I are going to kind of just walk around the airplanes and point out some of the facts that we just talked about.
I'm here with Bill Hardy. It's good to see you again.
Nice to meet you again. Yeah.
Where did you grow up, Bill?
I grew up in Corning, California. I was born on my grandfather's ranch out in the boonies near south of Corning, California.
Did you ever think you'd be a pilot?
Yeah, I got hooked on pilot because we lived on the where they had the beacons 10 miles apart for the airmail pilots to fly at night, and that went right over our house. And so the first time I got close to an airplane, which I was always intrigued by them because they flew over all times of the day and the night, and I was going to school one morning, and there was an airmail airplane sitting in the middle of a vacant lot next door to my school, and I went over to look at it, and one of my schoolmates was there, and he said, "Don't get near the airplane." He'd been given 50 cents by the pilot because he ran out of water, and he was supposed to guard the airplane, so I had to steer clear of it. So pretty soon the pilot came back with some hose and clamps, and we carried a couple of 5-gallon jugs of water over to him. So I helped the pilot cut the hoses and install the thing, so that then the pilot gave me 50 cents for helping him. When we got the water in the airplane, he started it up and took off. So that was my first, and I even got 50 cents for helping the pilot. My schoolmate, who had been given 50 cents when the pilot left to go in town to get the pieces, was kind of jealous of me because I became the pilot's helper on putting the airplane back together.
All right, all right.
I was in about the 6th grade, I think.
What types of planes did you fly?
Name a war, and I'll tell you what kind of
All
airplanes.
right. Well, you flew the Hellcat. What was that like to fly?
It was gave you a good ego trip because you had 6 50 caliber machine guns right at the others, right at the pipper of your sight on your windshield.
What was it like to go up against a Zero, combat against a Zero in a fight?
Oh, by the time we got the Zeros, didn't have a chance with the 50 caliber. I mean, with the Hellcat, they were a piece of cake.
And you're an ace in a day. Can you tell us what that is? What's an ace in a day?
Well, you know what an ace is? An ace is anybody that has shot down, had victories over 5 enemy aircraft. And I did that in one night, and so I'm an ace in an evening, really. With a Hellcat, it's a piece of cake. It's like shooting fish in a barrel.
Well, thank you for your service, Bill.
Okay, I didn't get in the service to be patriotic. I got in the service because there were no jobs in the 1938 and 39, and when I first became an enlisted man, there were no jobs for high school or college graduates. So I got in there because they paid me to go out and work on airplanes and fly in the back cockpit or the right-hand seat of airplanes. So I thought that was a real good deal to get paid for what you love to do. But it wasn't patriotism, it was because I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About here at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.